action.
All right, so the part of this, so shifting from all that, the part of this that I thought was really interesting, beyond just the financial discussion and just sort of the way that the future of commerce is going to work and all that, is you really believe that Bitcoin can change the way governments act, the way we as individuals respond to and talk to our governments and all of that. So I'm giving you sort of a broad question there, but tell me about that.
I hear people asking me all the time, well, aren't governments going to regulate Bitcoin? And what about government regulation of Bitcoin? But I think they're asking the wrong question. The real end game here isn't that governments are going to regulate Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to regulate governments. Bitcoin is going to limit the power that every government on the planet has to control people. Look at what happened a few years ago in Cyprus, where every single person there had, a big percentage of their bank account just completely wiped out. Bitcoin gives the ability to people to opt out of that sort of system. In the United States here, the government can print as much money at any time for any reason, and you better believe that they're doing that all the time. If you're using Bitcoin, that sort of thing can't happen. And one of these really interesting ideas that had never occurred to me when I was, going on my binge of reading economics books as a kid was by Milton Friedman, and he pointed out the idea of bracket creep. And the government inflates the currency every single year, so maybe you have 2 or 3% inflation, and one year to the next, that's not that big of a deal, but compounded year after year after year, before you know it, $100,000 isn't, in 10 or 20 years from now, it's not going to be that big of an income.
Right.
But the government tax brackets are likely to stay about the same. So maybe $50,000 income today is the equivalent of $100,000 year income after however many years it takes to compound to that. So instead of being in a 25% tax bracket, you're going to be in a 45% tax bracket, even though you're not actually earning any more money each year. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin is the exact opposite of that. There's no central authority that can make more Bitcoins out of thin air, unlike the US dollar. So that's a really powerful way of people to opt out of this government inflation racket that they have, that they use to bump everybody into higher tax brackets year after year.
Right. So it's kind of hard to picture what this would actually look like in the future. But if everything you're predicting and would like to happen happened, in effect, as the years go by, people will obviously be buying more Bitcoin, using the US dollar in whatever country they're in, whatever their currency is, they're going to use that less. And by just doing that, the governments will in effect have less control over the people, because all of your interactions, all of your exchanges will have nothing to do with the government.
You can see I'm grinning from ear to ear as someone.
But isn't Bitcoin illegal in China, or they just changed something, or wasn't there something just in the last couple of weeks?
They've changed a lot of things in China at the moment, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. If you have access to the internet, you can use Bitcoin. And this is really, really, really exciting. And I guess it's worth pointing out too, I wasn't born a libertarian. I didn't really have any political views at all, and it was the more economics I studied, the more of a libertarian I became. And then it was kind of really depressing, because I looked around the world and governments are manipulating the economy in all these ways. They're slowing down the entire world's rate of economic growth. And if you have economic growth of 2 or 3 or 4% per year, from one year to the next, that's not that big of a deal, but compounded year after year after year, it really makes a huge, huge difference. And so even if the government's just slowing down the rate of economic growth by just 1%, and I think it's substantially more than that, compound that times 100 or a couple hundred years, we'd all have flying cars and space stations by now and be living forever because of little nanotechnology robots that can go in our body and fix everything that's wrong with us. And who doesn't want that sort of thing? And if you don't want it, don't participate. You're not forced to participate. And that's what we're talking about. We're slowing down the rate of progress of all of humankind. And Bitcoin is this incredibly powerful tool to help speed up that rate of progress.
Man, there's so many different ways I could go with that. So the dystopian future part of this that I guess I would fear is that if the government loses control of the monetary system, all the governments lose control, and the only way they can stop us now is to go after the internet, wouldn't it stand to reason that governments would start going after the internet? Well, like literally the internet itself, like actually try to disconnect the internet, whatever that means.
But lots of governments are dependent on the internet as well. But there's also lots of smart people that are building these mesh networks, in which it's not dependent on the same sort of centralized infrastructure that a lot of the internet is today. And those technologies are only going to get more and more powerful and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, thanks to Moore's law. And before we know it, we'll all be able to connect with everybody else, and we won't be dependent on these big ISPs. And
how do they go about doing that, like a mesh network like that? So basically, in effect, getting us off Google and Verizon and whatever else, right? Like that those won't be the only pathways. How do these guys get out of that system?
Well, I think we're of a similar age. And I'm sure both of us remember before there were smartphones and before there were iPhones and before there was Siri and Google and all these things. And now you have the entire database of human knowledge right in your hand. And if you buy a used iPhone, you can get it for about $100.
Yeah.
And in another couple of years, that's going to be, and you can buy a cheap Android phone for $20 right now. Like, that's incredible. So the hardware to do this is going to get cheaper and cheaper. The technology is going to become more and more accessible. It's going to be cheaper and cheaper for anybody to put satellites up in space. And maybe governments are going to try and stop this and do bad things to do that, but if they start trying to shut down the world's internet to prevent people from using their own money, that's just a fantastic example that the government people are the bad people, and they're not our friends, and they're not here to help us. Anybody that's here trying to say, hey, we're going to turn off the internet if you use money without our permission, those are bad people. We shouldn't support them. We shouldn't want anything to do with them. And that's just more proof that we do need Bitcoin to opt out of their violent, coercive system to control us all. We shouldn't be their tax cattle.
Right.
We shouldn't be their livestock.
Yeah, it's a great sell for libertarianism in general. Like, this is why I'm always, selling the ideas of freedom. It's like, if you think everyone complains, the government's horrible all the time, yet half the people want to give them more money and give them more control. And it's like, no.
Do the opposite.
Yeah, you don't starve them, but let's try it that way. So I think I'm following all the logic here. So when you talk about why this would basically stop wars do you mean because of economic reasons, or because basically we wouldn't be giving the economic reasons, meaning countries wouldn't have an economic incentive to fight, but also that the people wouldn't be giving them enough money to fight in the first place? Is that...
So there's a couple of reasons, and since we have quite the big audience, I've never talked about one of them publicly. Really up until now, and we'll talk about that one today.
All right, let's roll.
But one of the easy, simple reasons is that lots of governments fund their wars via inflation. They just print money, and they use that money to buy guns and bombs and tanks, and they use it to murder people all over the world. And war is just a euphemism for murder. You're killing... Sometimes some bad people get killed, but for the most part, innocent civilians are getting killed all over the world. And let's say somebody came in here and stole my wallet and ran off down the street. If I started chasing them down the street and shooting guns, and I shot a dozen innocent people that didn't steal my wallet, I said, oh, it's okay because I was trying to get the bad guy who stole my wallet, I would go to jail for being a murderer, for killing all those innocent people. So let's take for granted, let's say Saddam Hussein was a really bad guy who deserved to be killed. They murdered more than 500,000 Iraqi children to do it, right? That's murder. You're killing kids. Right? It doesn't matter how bad of a guy Saddam Hussein is, you don't go and kill a bunch of kids to get him. And that's exactly what the United States government did. And if any individual did that, trying to catch a common thief, you would go to jail for it. But for whatever reason, people just have amnesia or closed eyes when governments do the exact same thing. If you're murdering innocent people, you're a murderer. And that's what governments do, and they do it primarily through printing money and use that to pay people to go and drop these bombs and guns and tanks. And Bitcoin takes that power away from them, because if the end game is to have Bitcoin replace the dollar, replace the euro, replace the yen. And when I'm saying Bitcoin today, I'm referring to Bitcoin Cash, to be clear.
Okay.
But replace all those things, and that takes away government's ability to inflate the currency to pay for all these things. And people maybe sometimes they worry, well, what about schools and roads and bridges and hospitals? Well, guess what? People love schools. They love hospitals. They love roads and bridges. Things that people like, people will be more than willing to pay for voluntarily. I'm not interested in paying to drop bombs on people in countries I've never been to and I'm probably never going to go to. And I think 99% of the people out there in the world also aren't interested in doing that. And for the 1% that are interested in doing it, do that with your money. Don't force me to participate.
Right.
The other really, really interesting way that I've never, ever spoken about publicly up until now, but I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are a big enough part of our society at this point where I'm not really worried about the attacks from governments on them. And initially, that was my strategy from day one. I wanted to spread Bitcoin to as many people around the world as quickly as I possibly could, so they would become too big and too widespread to be shut down. So if people are using Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to buy, their groceries and their diapers and things like that, how can governments shut it down? But here's an interesting way.
But do you think we've hit that threshold
No,
yet?
But we're getting pretty darn close to that. And at this point, there's 100-something, 200-something governments around the world. If one government wants to shut it down, that probably makes other governments like it even more. I would guess maybe there's a bit of that at this moment. China has been cracking down on Bitcoin a bit. I would guess Trump and the U.S. government maybe like Bitcoin a little bit more now that China doesn't like it.
Which we could use a little bit of that leverage with China, right? Because how much do we owe them in actual dollars?
Sure, maybe we can pay them back in Bitcoin for pennies on the dollars in the future once the RMB goes to nothing because everybody's using cryptocurrencies. But another really, really interesting thing, so let's go back in time, and a bad guy that everybody agrees upon, Adolf Hitler. I think pretty much...
I thought I could do one show without a Hitler reference.
Pretty much, well, I'm playing it safe in my example here as well.
Okay.
So let's say, and I'm sure you can find people out there that don't think he was a bad guy, but the vast majority of society does think he was a bad guy. So Adolf Hitler started doing bad things with money stolen from people in the form of taxes. And what did the rest of the world do? They started stealing money from other people in the form of taxes, had kidnapping and slavery in the form of a draft, right? And lots of people went voluntarily, but I'm sure lots of people went involuntarily, and we should be clear with our language, right? The draft is the moral equivalent of kidnapping and slavery. They're literally kidnapping people and enslaving them and sending them off to some far-off land to fight against their will. And if they don't do that, they go to jail, and half the time when they go off to the far-off land, they get killed as well. So the draft is the moral equivalent of kidnapping and slavery. So Adolf Hitler is a bad guy. Everybody agrees with that. Almost everybody. But then the rest of the governments around the world start going and doing all this crazy bad stuff. Well, what would happen if we had this online anonymous digital cash in which people could pool their resources and set up a betting pool? And anybody that correctly predicts the right day that Adolf Hitler dies can anonymously collect this, millions of dollars in anonymous digital cash that people all chipped in $1 here and $1 there and $10 here. I bet you could have raised a lot of money for someone to correctly predict the right day that Adolf Hitler dies.
Well, I said dystopian before. Now you're going real dystopian.
Well, is
right?
this dystopia or is this utopia, right? Imagine if people could have raised $10 million voluntarily from around the world, and Adolf Hitler can't round up Jews and send them off to the concentration camps anymore. Is that a dystopia or a utopia?
Well, it's right. So it's a utopia in this explanation. There's a piece of me, and I love all these dystopian movies, which is why I can go down this road in all kinds of different ways. There's a piece that's sort of like, wow, you could really end up creating some insane vigilante system where it's not just Hitler that's going to be taken out, but anybody that gets smeared by the media or whatever, and then this is constantly happening to people that actually don't deserve it. So that would be the dystopian part. But in this part...
So I've been thinking about this for